Gallier Gatherings are being offered to you for free in this virtual platform. If you like our programming, please become a member. Membership has its perks. If you are not a Louisiana or New Orleans resident, you can take advantage of the North American Reciprocal Museum Association, where you can receive membership benefits with museums and cultural institutions across the United States, Canada, Bermuda, El Salvador, and Mexico. Membership also helps with sponsoring programs such as this. If you join now, your membership is good through the end of December 2021. If you are impacted by COVID-19, we are offering student memberships for $25 through December 2021. We are now open for guided tours. Please visit our website to book a tour today. Our online gift shop has recently acquired some new products. We have some Blackbird letterpress items that will make a great gift for feminists of any age. If you order by December 17th, we can guarantee shipping in time for Christmas or by the end of Hanukkah. The Hermann-Grima Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, aims to preserve and maintain the architecture and decorative arts of the homes so they may act as a microcosm of life during the 19th and 20th centuries to inspire educational experiences and discourse around our collective past and its contribution to the culture of New Orleans. For this talk, we would like to welcome panelists from Southeastern Louisiana University for a discussion as part of our traveling exhibit on display till Friday, December 11th, titled Determined to Rise, the Women's Suffrage Movement in Louisiana. To tell you a little bit more about the exhibit we have on display. So the Centennial Women's Suffrage Project that developed this traveling exhibition is a 10-member interdisciplinary team from Southeastern Louisiana University, comprised of English, history, and communication scholars, a web builder, an event planner, a graphic artist, a documentarian, a teacher, education specialist, and a public relations practitioner. They developed an approach to commemorating the centennial of ratification of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote, which consisted of panel presentations, the Grit and Grace Women's Conference held pre-COVID, the traveling exhibit, and the Library of Congress online course for social studies teachers in Louisiana on the women's suffrage movement. 2 of the panels were live pre-COVID. One was held on the Southeastern campus in conjunction with the National Women's History Museum. Another was held at the Old Governor's Mansion in Baton Rouge and was hosted by Preserve Louisiana. 2 other panels have been conducted via Zoom by Red Magnolia Theater Company and Livingston Center for Literacy and Technology. This is the last planned panel of speakers. The traveling exhibit began circulating in the state in August. It has been hosted by museums, libraries, and heritage sites. It is now on display at Hermann-Grima House until December 11th, located at 820 St. Louis Street, and it is free and open to the public. It will go next to HOMA, January 4th through the 15th, located at Terrebonne Parish Library System, and then return to Shreveport in January 18th through the 29th at Centennial College of Louisiana. The exhibit will have been displayed throughout the state by summertime. So we will have 3 panelists today. The first is Carol Madere. She's a professor of communication in the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Southeastern Louisiana University. Dr. Madere will speak on the national movement and laws which have changed to grant more women civil rights.
Glad to be with you tonight.
We are glad you're here with us. Lisa Moody of the English department is a full-time faculty member at Southeastern Louisiana University in Hammond, Louisiana. Dr. Moody will describe the state suffrage movement. Dr. Moody.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So very glad that you're here with us. And the last speaker will be joining us a little bit later in the talk. This is Dr. Elizabeth Robertson Hornsby. She's a full-time faculty member in the Department of Languages and Communication at Southeastern Louisiana University, where she teaches communication and media studies classes. Dr. Hornsby will discuss the Black suffragist movement. So if you have any questions, please use the chat feature throughout the talk. And then if you have them at any point during the lecture, I would just, save them or submit them to the chat feature located at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, I present to you all Drs. Madere, Moody, and Hornsby.
It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed the Union. Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less. To the wrongs that need resistance, to the right that needs assistance, to the future in the distance, give yourselves. The first quote is from Susan B. Anthony, who along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton started the women's suffrage movement. The second quote is from Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and founder of the League of Women Voters, who saw the women's suffrage movement through to completion. That process took 72 years, with the 19th Amendment finally being passed by Congress on June 4th, 1919, and ratified by 36 states on August 18th, 1920. This year marks the centennial of women's right to vote. Tonight, I will discuss women's political participation before suffrage, how women began to enter politics, the anti-suffrage movement, laws that have changed since women entered politics, and finally, the challenges women still face today. Not having the vote themselves, women turned to influencing the male vote. For example, women would attend political conventions, attract the attentions of young male voters, and decline those whose political persuasions they disagreed with. Women were also fierce reformers because it wasn't considered unladylike to join women's clubs and seek to make the world a better place. Thus, they campaigned against all manner of social ills, ranging from prostitution to prohibition. One of the most feared firebrands was Carrie Nation, who would gather women together to protest outside bars and saloons and take her famous axe to kegs of liquor. Carrie Nation and the temperance movement made a lot of news, but being associated with them held back the women's suffrage movement from achieving its goals. In New Orleans, for example, Mayor Martin Behrman mobilized his political machine to defeat the statewide suffrage movement proposed by the legislature in 1918 because he didn't want women to be able to vote for prohibition. Through building their own social and philanthropic organizations, women became very good at understanding how to put political pressure on a system that wouldn't include them. They used marches and picket lines, even in terrible weather, to prick the consciences of those in power. The more affluent, like Alva Belmont, used their positions in society to make women's suffrage movement a fashionable idea. This was persuasive not only to the average man or woman, but also to the media who covered their celebrity events with fawning attention. At meetings of their women's clubs, they would feature speakers about women's suffrage who could make their members better informed about the need for the vote. They could transform everyday objects into political vehicles. For example, a pamphlet offering household hints that could contain a political message as well. A cookbook could help would-be suffragists spend less time in the kitchen. A hay wagon could display campaign messages or provide a podium for speakers. Here you see a women's suffrage hay wagon and a photo depicting women protesting in front of the White House in the rain to get President Woodrow Wilson to recognize their determination to vote. Here's a chart made by famed suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. It was used in testimony before Congress. It shows the kind of limited suffrage women had in each state that did not offer full suffrage. It shows that women's suffrage expanded piecemeal throughout the 19th century, with certain groups of women being allowed to vote on certain issues. It comes from the records of the U.S. House of Representatives. Many of the first women in politics entered to finish their husband's term if he died while in office. Doris Holland Rhodes, who was the first woman to serve in the Louisiana legislature, completed her husband's term as the Louisiana State Senator for St. Helena and Tangipahoa parishes from 1936 to 1940. She was then elected to the Louisiana State House of Representatives and served from 1940 to 1948. Rose McConnell Long, the widow of Huey Long, was the first woman from Louisiana to ever serve in the U.S. Senate. After Huey's assassination in 1935, Rose Long was appointed to serve in his seat until a special election could be held. She won the special election in the following year to serve out the remaining months of her husband's term. Corinne Claiborne Lindy Boggs completed the term of her husband, Hale Boggs, after his plane vanished over Alaska in 1972. She later became the first woman from Louisiana to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where she served for 18 years. Catherine Long succeeded her husband, Congressman Gillis Long, in 1985. And First Lady Elaine Edwards was appointed by her husband, Governor Edwin Edwards, to complete the unexpired term of Senator Allen Ellender. Another way that women entered politics was as members of political families. Former U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu is the daughter of former mayor of New Orleans, Moon Landrieu. At 24, Mary Landrieu was the youngest woman to ever serve in the Louisiana legislature. She went on to serve as state treasurer for 8 years and then as U.S. Senator from 1996 to 2015. Kathleen Babino Blanco served as the 54th governor and the first woman governor of Louisiana from 2004 through 2008. She was also the first woman to represent the citizens of Lafayette in the state legislature and the first woman elected to the Public Service Commission. Women have been asked to serve as vice presidential nominees by both political parties. Geraldine Ferraro became the first woman on the national ticket when she became Democrat Walter Mondale's running mate in 1984. Sarah Palin became the first woman on the Republican ticket as John McCain's running mate in 2007. Pictured here are some of the women who have blazed the trail for other women who wanted to serve their country in the halls of government. Jeanette Rankin is the first woman elected to Congress. As a pacifist, she voted against America's entry into both world wars. She also introduced the legislation that would eventually become the 19th Amendment. Nancy Pelosi has served in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1987. She followed her father into politics. In 2019, she began her 17th term in Congress. She is the only woman in the United States history to serve as Speaker of the House and one of the few people actually, to have served in that role twice. As Speaker, Pelosi is the highest ranking female elected official in United States history. Madeleine Albright, a naturalized citizen whose parents fled Czechoslovakia in 1948, became the first woman in US history to serve as Secretary of State. Sandra Day O'Connor became the first female justice on the US Supreme Court. She was appointed in 1981 by President Ronald Reagan. Hillary Clinton was the first female presidential nominee from one of two major parties. After a distinguished career as First Lady, US Senator from New York, and Secretary of State in the Obama administration, she ran for president in 2016. And now we will hear from Dr. Elizabeth Hornsby. I need to go to her
Scholar Anna Julia Cooper stated, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood without violence or special patronage. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me." The crux of Cooper's quote is that her mere existence as a Black
Dr.
woman—
Madere, can you change your screen to show the video, please?
Hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hornsby.
I will continue with mine until we figure out how to bring in Elizabeth's contribution.
Okay.
A former slave, Sojourner Truth, became an outspoken advocate for abolition, temperance, and civil and women's rights in the 19th century. In 1851, she delivered her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech, which is recognized as one of the most famous speeches for women's rights in history. In it, she challenged prevailing notions of racial and gender inferiority and inequality by reminding listeners of her combined strength. Truth was nearly 6 feet tall, and female status. Ida B. Wells Barnett was a prominent journalist, activist, and researcher in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Wells Barnett used her skills as a journalist to shed light on the conditions of African Americans throughout the South. She was often ridiculed and ostracized by women's suffrage organizations in the United States and refused to march in the back of the 1913 Washington, D.C. suffrage parade when its organizers asked her to. Mary Church Terrell was a well-known African American activist who championed racial equality and women's suffrage in the late 19th and early 20th century. She actively embraced women's suffrage, which she saw as essential to elevating the status of Black women and consequently the entire race. She actively campaigned for Black women's suffrage. She even picketed the Wilson White House with members of the National Women's Party in her zeal for women's suffrage. In 1909, Terrell was among the founders and charter members of the NAACP. Shirley Chisholm is the first African-American woman elected to Congress and the first African-American to run for president. She was a founding member of both the Congressional Black Caucus and the National Women's Political Caucus. Chisholm used to say, "I am, was, and always will be a catalyst for change." This year, of course, we have in Senator Kamala Harris, the first African-American woman and the first person of South Asian descent to serve as Vice President of the United States. In 2016, Carla Hayden, an American librarian, became the 14th Librarian of Congress. Hayden is the first woman and the first African-American to hold the post. Even in 2020, 100 years after ratification of the 19th Amendment, women still encounter barriers to running for political office that men don't. First, female candidates receive biased coverage in both traditional and social media. According to a global study released by the Wilson Center, male and female candidates receive a similar volume of attention on social media, but female candidates receive more attacks from right-wing and fake news accounts. A researcher found, for example, that tweets were more concerned with a woman's character than her policy positions. In fact, online harassment is a major problem for women candidates and politicians. From love letters to threats of death, rape, beatings, or abduction, the constant inundation of messages can impact the way candidates run their campaigns. For example, candidate Molly Sheehan's campaign refrained from posting details on social media about which events she would be attending. The traditional media coverage of female candidates is not much better. Researchers found that coverage of female candidates is heavily biased against them, both in quantity and quality, which affects their viability as candidates. Another hurdle for female candidates is fundraising. Men are still making the majority of political contributions, and male candidates still raise more money than female candidates. Also, even though research has shown that a majority of Americans view men and women as equally competent leaders, women are less likely to be recruited to run than men are. Women also have less freedom to reconcile family and work responsibilities with a political career. This problem is made worse by campaign finance laws, which don't permit women to pay for childcare while on the campaign trail. A congressional candidate in New York successfully lobbied the Federal Election Commission in 2018 to allow using campaign money to pay for childcare costs, but that only applies to those running for federal office. In Louisiana, Democratic State House candidate Morgan Lamonder had her request denied by the State Board of Ethics, which had allowed a Republican male candidate to claim campaign-related childcare expenses in the year 2000. After some backlash, the board reversed itself. And of course, gender stereotypes persist. Women candidates still have to prove that they're not just knowledgeable and competent, but also likable. One of the reasons the goals of the women's suffrage movement took over 70 years to achieve was its inability to speak with one voice for women. The powerful anti-suffrage movement was a force in American politics for 50 years. The National Association opposed to women's suffrage was founded in 1911, some 42 years after the suffrage movement had a national organization. But don't imagine that these were timid housewives who feared the rough and tumble world of politics. The antis, as they were called, were civic-minded reformers who were educated, affluent, professional women. Many of the antis insisted on being called by their husbands' names with somewhat quaint and comical results. One prominent anti, for example, was Mrs. General William Tecumseh Sherman. The antis wanted to maintain the male-headed family rather than the individual as the unit of representative government. Southern antis did not want a federal suffrage amendment because it would allow more African Americans to vote. Some affluent antis viewed suffrage as a threat to their positions of privilege. And of course, the antis did not want to lose protections in the law for women should women's societal roles change. Pictured is an anti-suffrage postcard showing a wife bullying her poor husband if she won suffrage. Also pictured is a photo from the Library of Congress showing the front of the headquarters of the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. Finally, there's a photo of a household hints pamphlet with an anti-suffrage message. It shows that the antis were just as skilled as the suffragists in the art of propaganda. One of the largest suffrage parades in history occurred on the day of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Throughout his term in office, suffragists picketed the White House, blaming Wilson for not supporting suffrage. Finally, at the beginning of his second term in office, Wilson addressed the Senate in support of the suffrage amendment. He said his change of heart had occurred because of women's efforts to help win World War I. The amendment failed by 2 votes. The following year, the suffrage amendment passed the House with 42 votes more than was required for a 2/3 majority. 2 weeks later, it passed the Senate with 2 votes more than the required 2/3 majority. Within 6 days of the beginning of the ratification cycle, 3 states had ratified it. Louisiana was one of 8 Southern states to reject it. Mississippi had the opportunity to cast the final vote for ratification, but the measure was defeated on March 29th. On August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the last state battleground for ratification. Both suffragists and antis were in Nashville to lobby for their cause. It came down to one tie-breaking vote by 24-year-old Harry Byrne, excuse me, who, although wearing the red rose representing the antis in his lapel, heeded his mother's entreaty to be a good boy and help Carrie Chapman Catt put the rat in ratification. After casting his vote for ratification, Byrne hid out in the attic of the state capitol for 3 hours to escape an angry mob. Shown here is a cartoon called April 1st, published April 1st, 1920 by Clifford Berryman, one of Washington, D.C.'s best known cartoonists in the early to mid 1900s. Berryman's cartoons were published in the Washington Post. In this image, Berryman portrays the Mississippi rejection as an April Fool's joke on supporters of women's suffrage. And now Dr. Moody will discuss the state suffrage movement.
All right, thank you, Carol. When we think about women's suffrage, we do tend to think in terms of a wave that swept the nation. But in truth, that wave was fed by several tributaries of smaller movements happening regionally and nationally that resulted in the passing of the 19th Amendment. Some examples of this are parallel reform movements advocating temperance and women's property laws, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, immigrant contributions to suffrage, and local movements such as the one that happened right here in Louisiana. And this is the one I'm going to focus on tonight. In the Louisiana suffrage movement, there are key events and leaders that worked in a unique way to bring about suffrage. Some notable figures are Caroline Merrick, Elizabeth Lyle Saxon, Frances Willard, and Kate Gordon. Mainly, I want to discuss some of the more difficult truths about suffrage, such as white supremacy and other complicated associations. There has been a tendency, which continues today, to try and divide and conquer women's movements by perpetuating a rhetoric that causes infighting that ultimately undermines women. In a chapter in Taking Off the White Gloves, titled Women's Suffrage and White Supremacy, Suzanne Lebsock discusses this complicated association in which suffragettes did not always clearly discredit white supremacy accusations, causing bifurcation and splintering throughout the history of the suffrage movement. Overall, my talk will have 3 parts, each very brief: legal, moral, and what we might call dark history. So most scholars agree that the Louisiana suffrage movement was launched in 1878 when a resident of St. Anna's Asylum, an institution for New Orleans destitute women and children, left a bequest of $1,000 to the asylum in a deathbed will. In other words, in a last-minute addendum to an earlier existing will. Several females, including Caroline Merrick and members of the all-female board of the asylum, witnessed this will. In spite of this, the probate court overturned the will because women were not deemed competent witnesses. The money went to the state and not to the asylum. So motivated by the St. Anna's incident, Caroline Merrick and Elizabeth Lyle Saxon petitioned for suffrage and secure 400 signatures using the argument of taxation without representation, as many women were landowners who did not always have a man to act for them. This petition is sent to the Constitutional Convention of 1879, forcing a vote. The initial appeal for suffrage argued that women who paid taxes were stakeholders in matters such as education and matters that affected domestic life, such as the sale of liquor, which was then banned, but just on Sundays. Women also sought the right to hold office and serve as legal witnesses for financial documents, such as wills. And Merrick helped secure an article in the Constitution making all women over 21 years of age eligible to hold office in connection with the public schools. Merrick and Saxon became the first women in Louisiana to address a public body, and both were eloquent speakers. A last and significant part of Merrick's argument was that Black men had the ballot, but women did not. This last appeal will become increasingly significant in a states' rights argument down the road that becomes associated with white supremacy ideology. The 1879 constitutional amendment failed to achieve enfranchisement for women, but it spurred the larger movement, particularly an argument that women needed to vote in order to maintain autonomy over the domestic sphere, involving issues that impacted hearth and home, such as education, poverty, property rights, prostitution, gambling, and inebriation. Early feminism seems to limit women to the domestic sphere as opposed to the public sphere. But it is important to recognize that this is a space through which women first harness their power as a collective body. Next, I will segue into some of the domestic and moral concerns associated with suffrage: temperance, education, and sewage. So, the Women's Christian Temperance Union organizes into 50 chapters, including New Orleans, paralleling the suffrage movement and becoming inextricably linked to it. Frances Willard, who was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union from 1879 to 98, persuaded Elizabeth Lyle Saxon to leave Louisiana to focus on temperance, but new leaders for suffrage will emerge. The temperance movement is linked to the demand for suffrage due to the belief that alcohol use led to the deterioration and destitution of domestic life. Frances Willard wrote, "Alcohol will so craze men that they will commit every crime and show the subtlest cruelty to those they love best." The argument here becomes that women need suffrage in order to protect the domestic sphere from social evils. In 1891, the Anti-Lottery League, a political action group, forms. So reform societies, which are also called auxiliary societies, that focused on moral issues such as alcohol, gambling, prostitution, and poverty, really transformed the women's movement, not only by giving a voice and a platform, but by helping women develop the skill set they needed to move into more public realms, which ultimately provided job skills and career training for women. In 1892, the Portia Club of New Orleans forms to promote suffrage. Caroline Merrick founded the Portia Club. It was an auxiliary of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. By 1895, the Portia Club divided and the ERA, which was the Equal Rights for All Club, formed. And so federal rights versus state rights becomes divisive here, and it starts to become very much into play, which is why all these different clubs are breaking off and forming. In 1896, the Louisiana Women's Suffrage Association forms. This was a cooperative effort after a visit by Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt. This is an effort to unify groups that were divided over states' rights and federal rights amendment drives. In 1898, the ERA Club initiates an amendment to the Louisiana State Constitution again to include women's suffrage. Kate and her sister Jean Gordon, among others, including national leader Carrie Chapman Catt, addressed this convention, representing a new generation of powerful female activism. This convention yielded both a gain and a loss for the women of Louisiana. The gain was tax-paying women earn the right to vote in person or by proxy to all questions of taxation. The loss was that an earlier gain from the 1879 convention, in which women could hold public offices and serve on boards, was removed. Only qualified federal voters could now do so. This is where matters begin to get a little dicey in the movement. In 1899, a petition is organized to hold a New Orleans election on a bond issue for sewage and drainage improvement, an ironic parallel to our current disaster. Many women were still too timid to approach the voting booth, so Kate Gordon organized and collected over 300 proxies, and 15,000 women cast their votes in total. Now, women were still considered incompetent witnesses, so Gordon had her Black coachmen witness these proxies. Again, the point being made here is that African American men had more rights than white women. Ultimately, Kate and Jean Gordon are going to argue for a states' rights suffrage amendment rather than a federal one because they wanted to institute Jim Crow laws that would enforce racial segregation in the vote. So lastly, I will talk a little bit about the conflict over white supremacy and the dark history that led to a states' rights position that undermined the national suffrage movement in Louisiana. In order to do this, we must backtrack just a step and look at how, as women promoted suffrage, they also started to actively work to limit or suppress the African American vote. So in 1898, a constitutional convention, while promoting female suffrage, also tries to eliminate the Black vote, as proposals are considered to limit qualifying voters based on first property ownership and then later education. Here is a line from the official journal of the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention. A citizen of Louisiana who happens to be a woman, no matter how highly educated, no matter how great her wealth, has no voice in the taxation of her property. Is she to be denied that which is not denied to an illiterate Negro who may be the fortunate possessor of a few $100s worth of property? This was introduced by A.W. Faulkner at the 1898 convention. The aim here of limiting voters based on such constraints is indicative of Jim Crow laws and becomes part of the states' rights argument. So in 1901, Kate Gordon, the Louisiana suffragette, moved to New York, and she becomes the corresponding secretary of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. But she will later resign from this suffrage association in 1909 due to her states' rights position. In 1903, the Louisiana Suffrage Association hosts its 35th annual, the National Suffrage Association hosts its 35th annual convention, and that was right here in New Orleans. So from 1914 to 1918, Gordon and the Women's Suffrage Party continue to appeal for a state suffrage amendment. They're trying to prevent a federal amendment, but are repeatedly defeated at the polls. They are outspoken about their divided aim at this point. A quote, "The white women of the South hold the balance of power. Their vote will eliminate the question of the Negro in politics, and it will be a free day for the South when the ballot is placed in the hands of its intelligent, cultured, pure, and noble womanhood." So the National Women's Party forms to begin to fight for a federal amendment for suffrage. In 1920, the States' Rights Bill is again defeated, but the federal amendment, the 19th Amendment, is ratified. Kate and Jean Gordon voted against it. In 1970, Louisiana ratifies the 19th Amendment, but this was a formality only since it was already federal law, as enough states had already ratified it. In 1972, the United States Congress passes the Equal Rights Act, the ERA. And as recently as 2019, Louisiana legislature again defeats the ERA ratification from the 1972 amendment. Louisiana did ratify it on January 15th, 2020, but it will be under review with the Supreme Court due to whether or not the deadline attached to the amendment can be enforced. So a little bit of the dark legacy history. 4 things. First of all, white supremacy and the idea of either restricting, eliminating, or reducing the African American vote continues to challenge the United States today. Secondly, the separate sphere ideology, sometimes called the cult of true womanhood, continues to limit the power of the female voice. 3, competing causes like prohibition that were not popular undermines enfranchisement efforts. Much like today, we see the pro-choice versus anti-choice regarding reproductive rights splits women politically today, dividing their power. And lastly, Jean Gordon and eugenics is probably worth a mention, but that is a controversial subject for another day. Thank you.
Female participation in government has inspired changes in laws that placed women at a significant disadvantage in society. Head and master or coverture laws gave men final say over all property owned jointly by a couple and all decisions related to any children of the marriage. These were replaced by the Married Women's Property Acts of 1839, which expanded the rights of married women to act as independent agents in legal contexts. In 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was enacted. It barred employee discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, color, religion, and sex. The inclusion of sex in the Title VII seemed to be almost an afterthought. Howard W. Smith of Virginia, a staunch opponent of civil rights legislation, offered the one-word amendment, according to some people, as a poison pill. Although the agency created by the act, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, viewed the sex amendment as a fluke and tended to ignore it, fully 1/3 of the complaints filed the first year charged discrimination on the basis of sex. The EEOC's apathy towards the sex amendment stimulated the formation of the National Organization of Women, whose initial goal was to pressure the agency to enforce the law. Title IX was signed into law in 1972. It forbids exclusion on the basis of sex from participation in any educational program or activity receiving federal assistance. It has received the most attention for its impact on athletics, particularly at the collegiate level. In 1973, the US Supreme Court made its landmark decision, Roe v. Wade, guaranteeing women's reproduction rights. In 1975, the US Supreme Court struck down Louisiana laws excluding women from jury service. That same year, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act made it unlawful for creditors to discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, and marital status. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 made discrimination on the basis of pregnancy illegal. According to researchers Corder and Walbrecht, women's turnout after suffrage lagged behind men's by a wide margin. Even 20 years later, women's turnout was still about 20 percentage points lower than men's, spurring magazine headlines such as, "Is women's suffrage a failure?" in Good Housekeeping, and "Are women a failure in politics?" in Harper. While it took decades for the voting gap between men and women to close, today women are more likely to vote than men. Women's participation in government is critically important. A central criterion in evaluating the health of democracy is the degree to which all citizens, men and women, are encouraged and willing to engage the political system and run for public office. More women in positions of political power confer a greater sense of legitimacy to the government, simply by virtue of the fact that it better reflects the gender breakdown of the national population. Electing more women increases the likelihood that policy debate and deliberation includes women's views and experiences. For decades after the 19th Amendment was ratified, the right to vote did not lead to a significant presence of women in government positions. However, the 116th Congress, which began its term in 2019, counted an unprecedented number of women as members, raising female membership to 102 in the House and 23 in the Senate. Women have come a long way since having to court marriage proposals to have political influence, but they still honor the women that helped them get there. In Rochester, New York, for example, women voters have a tradition of sticking their "I voted" stickers to the headstone of Susan B. Anthony's grave. Somehow, I think she'd like that. Thank you. I think I can show the video now.
I think Dr. Hornsby just joined us right on time.
Oh, good.
So we can likely do the slides for Dr. Hornsby, and she can speak.
I think you're muted.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know where we are in the presentation.
We just finished Dr. Moody and Madere's presentation, so you're right on time.
Okay, well, I apologize because forward thinking I should have added slides in case I made it here to talk. I made the video thinking that it would take my place, so I don't really have slides, but I can sort of talk through because I think Dr. Madere has a slide in her presentation of trailblazers, and then a slide about Black women suffragists that sort of highlights everything that I would have said had I had made slides. And I apologize for the video because I really thought it came out well, and I hate that. You know,
Please show it, Elizabeth.
I don't. Well,
I was not able to show it because of technology. So please show it if you can.
That's the part that is I don't know that I can. I don't know why it wouldn't work for you. So but anyway, I don't want to keep up too much time, but I think based on what Dr. Madere has already said, in terms of Black women and the suffrage movement, what is the sort of key focus, or at least the key focus that I tried to highlight in the work that I did with the Centennial Women Suffrage Project and then in the video, is that for Black women, it was never just an issue of gender, but they also always had to contend with that issue of race. And it is a struggle that you see even now when you fast forward to 2020 and you look at sort of the work that the Black political work that is taking place right now, that it is still a battle of, is it race before gender or gender before race, or how do you sort of negotiate those tensions? And so it's really important. It was really important for me to trace those roots back to the suffrage movement, and really, the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment really were sort of the impetus of these discussions of having to choose, because the white women that were sort of held up as the foundational members of the movement made some fairly racist statements. And at that point, how do you kind of lock arms in a battle for the rights for your gender when you feel like the person that you're locking arms with doesn't even see you as a human being. And so I think that the sort of negotiation that these Black women suffragists had to do, particularly the first and second generation ones, really the first generation ones that were coming out of the civil rights movement, we see that sort of, we see the grit that it took to do that. We see that now as, you know, in our current Black political leaders. So it's really, it was really important for me to trace that back. I mean, you can talk about Harriet Tubman, you can talk about Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is such an interesting character for me, particularly because there's so much sort of mystery and mythos behind who this woman was, and particularly how she was wielded by white women suffragists to advance their agendas when necessary. And you see that most clearly in the Ain't I a Woman speech, which the original account of that speech, which was written, a journalist wrote about it right after it was given in 1851 at the Ohio Women's Convention. In that first account, Ain't I a Woman is not even mentioned. Sojourner Truth, according to historical accounts, spoke with a northern dialect. She, you know, was not learned, and some say that she couldn't even read or write, but she didn't speak with a Southern slang dialect. So fast forward to 1863, when a second account of that of her speech at the 1851 convention comes out, that's where you hear that phrase that is popularized and one that's quoted, "Ain't I a woman?" And she's speaking with this very Southern dialect, and she is imploring her audience to see her humanity and say, "Ain't I a woman too?" And of course, this is, I mean, it is dramatic, it is emotional. I mean, I've heard 1,000 dramatic readings of it. And it is the version of that speech that is the most popular. However, it is not the most accurate. But it was needed in that movement to sort of, to galvanize Black women in a way to be more supportive, because you are at this crux of, am I going to pick my race over my gender? So they needed Sojourner Truth to represent a bridge. And by reframing that speech as a bridge, it spoke to the white women who were like, well, she is a woman, but they were still able to maintain some superiority. It spoke to the Black women who fundamentally were connected to her call, "Ain't I a Woman?" It did rhetorically what it needed to do, even if it was historically inaccurate. And I think what we're seeing now, particularly Dr. Martha Jones wrote a book called Vanguard that details Black women's suffrage much more eloquently and beautifully than I can. But what we see is that Black women have always been agents of political organization. They've always done it in the face of challenge to both their race and their gender. And that when called upon, they are ready to mobilize to push efforts towards liberty and freedom forward. And so if we contextualize that to what we saw in 2020, and we look at figures like Stacey Abrams, who some people say she helped register over 1 million people to vote, this sort of, she sits very comfortably within the Black women political tradition of fighting against race and gender to advance an agenda of justice. And so I think that it is fitting that we are in this political moment with our vice president-elect, with so many Black women and women of color in prominent political positions. I think it's so fitting that we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of suffrage for white women, because Black women did not get the right to vote actually until many years later. I think it's so fitting that we are celebrating that, because it gives it a chance to really dissect and fully understand the history and what it took to get to the place that we're at right now, and to take a critical look at, you know, what we call the right to vote. And so anyway, I apologize again for the technical difficulties and being late, but that really is the crux of what I would say. And I think we can learn a lot. I'll tell another quick story that is more relevant to Louisiana. In 1903, the NAWSA was having its convention, and Black women were effectively barred from participating, even though at that point, Black women had created their own clubs, suffrage clubs, temperance clubs, religious clubs, educational clubs that were all fighting to see equality in terms of education, particularly in health. Women had all these clubs, and that's where their political mobilization was occurring. But they were barred from participating in that convention. And so Sylvanie F. Williams, who was at that time the president of the Phyllis Wheatley Club in New Orleans, somehow maneuvered, and there's a lot of, it's not really clear how she did that, because Susan B. Anthony did not really want to meet with her, but somehow she persuaded her to meet Sylvanie F. Williams persuaded Susan B. Anthony to meet with her in her club before the convention to sort of talk with Susan B. Anthony about the plight of Black women in this right to suffrage. And I think that is such an important story that sometimes gets left out or overlooked, that one, it must have taken a lot of persuasion for that conversation to happen. Because at that time, Susan B. Anthony had made very publicly very racist statements about Black people in general, particularly Black men. And the split in the women's suffrage movement had happened, you know, those that were for universal suffrage, but really white women before Black women, or before Black men. All of those things had occurred by 1903. And so the racial tension was thick. And then we're in New Orleans. And so then you have to think about sort of the racial climate of New Orleans in 1903. So the context of that conversation in and of itself is historical in that it even happened. And there's a quote that Sylvanie Williams says when addressing Anthony. She says, "The colored woman has a crown of thorns continually pressed upon her brow, yet she is advancing. And sometimes you find her further on than you would have expected." And I think that encapsulates Black women's political participation from abolitionist movements, through suffrage, through civil rights, and even in this political moment that we find ourselves in, is that yet she is advancing. That the sort of the narrative of Black women's participation in politics in all its ways is that is continually advancing, always in spite of the challenges, it's always moving forward. And I'm just so honored to have had the opportunity to really dig in and to continue to dig into that history, and to continue to make visible the names of Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells Barnett and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and these women who are not as, we don't have the same name recognition as, you know, Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but bared the brunt of the work, right? But bared a lot of not only the sexism that is associated with that, you know, the plight for the right to vote, but also the racism that was happening in tandem. And it is such an honor to honor these women. And I hope that, you know, that their stories continue to be told, because what we're seeing in 2020, there's a direct historical line to what was happening in 1920 and in 1820. And it's really important that those stories are continually told. So thank you for your time. I think that's all I have right now.
Thank you so much. It was perfect. Thank you. It was a perfect end to you all's presentation. So ladies, thank you so much. I want to invite the audience to submit your questions to the chat feature. And also, if you want to share or catch something that you didn't catch at the beginning, this is being recorded and it will be available on our website 24 hours after this event. So without further ado, I don't see any questions in the Q&A feature at this point. So please submit your questions. So I'll just start with the first question, and then you all feel free to add to the the Q&A feature. So I'll just start with like, how could I pose this? Now, this is an oversimplification, but I think inquiring minds would want to know. So this is a question for all of the panelists. Would you say, or is it true that the women's suffrage movement has its roots or was born out of the abolitionist movement? How true would that statement be?
That's absolutely true. And in fact, Frederick Douglass, was one of the most prominent abolitionists, but he was also present at the Seneca Falls Convention. And he gave this impassioned speech on the last day defending women having the right to vote. And, the convention participants were balking at voting for that until he spoke. And so his contribution to propelling the movement forward cannot be underestimated.
Yeah, and definitely. I mean, abolitionist networks really laid the framework for organization for suffrage, because you had suffragists giving anti-slavery speeches, so they were able to hone their rhetorical skills in terms of connecting with audiences. They got some name visibility. They were writing, and then a lot of the participants in the Underground Railroad also then later became participants in the suffrage movement, because this idea of freedom and rights as a human project resonated within abolitionist circles, and then into suffrage. I think where it got tricky is when you inserted that conversation of race and who gets to experience these rights first. When we're in the all in this together conversation, we're all in this together, but when all of a sudden somebody jumps to the front of the line, it's like, wait a minute, no, we're all supposed to do this at the same time. So then you sort of have to confront those ideologies of, we all deserve this, but who deserves it first? But I think what abolitionist movements did is that it provided a framework for organization that you can see very clearly in suffrage organizational tactics.
And actually, both the abolition movement and the women's suffrage movement go back, their roots really go back to American transcendentalism and the work of Margaret Fuller, who was one of the first published writers about female rights. So actually going back to to Emerson and Thoreau, because the transcendentalists believed that soul had no gender and that soul had no race, and that we all were connected to what they called the oversoul. So they really believed that our bodies were just the vessels of our soul, but we were all connected through our souls. So they were the early advocates of abolition and women's rights and rights of Native Americans. And it really, I think, goes back to the transcendentalist movement, which led into the abolitionist movement. And also, I noticed in the chat window, not to turn the subject, but somebody was asking about recommended reading on this topic. And we do have a website called gritandgrace100.com. And on that website, I think we have our bibliography up there. And so that we have a lot of recommended readings that you can go to the Grit and Grace 100 website, just to answer the chat question.
One last thing on that question, I just remembered the impetus for the Seneca Falls Convention was that Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were not allowed inside the abolition movement meeting, like convention, and they were mad about that. And so they decided they would have their own convention.
And actually, Lucretia Mott was also a Quaker. And the Quaker movement in the United States was also closely associated with abolition. They were part of the Underground Railroad. again, believers and women's rights as well. So there's a lot of different influences that kind of all fed into this movement.
Thank you. That was amazing. You answered the question, so I'll proceed with the next question. Thank you so much. Oh, we have a question. Thank you. How do you see the contributions of women like Angela Davis in the feminist movement to unite white and Black women in unifying their efforts?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think I would counter that with, what is your definition of feminism? Because I think that's key in sort of understanding how you would talk about unification. I think one of the things that comes out of the political tradition, the more radical political tradition of Black feminism that is more closely associated to Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, and some others, is that, you know, reconciliation without accountability is accommodation. And that in a lot of these projects, we talk about unifying, we talk about reconciliation, but there's never a mechanism to hold people accountable for their actions or hold them accountable to the unification that they are wanting to occur, right? So I think what Angela Davis does is that she is constantly the voice of accountability in projects of unification and reconciliation, where, you know, in some ways there it's like, okay, we're all women, race should be put aside because the political project to advance the eradication of sexism and patriarchy and all those sort of second wave feminist ideologies are, you know, important. You can't ignore how race intersects with gender and class and other things. And I think that is what's really amazing about studying Black women's suffrages, is that you see so clearly how they are constantly having to contend with both race and gender. Even, you know, they tried to participate, but they couldn't because they were women. They tried to participate, they couldn't because they were Black. They tried to participate, you know, it's this constant battle of being shut in, but then included when they're needed, but then shut out. And then you see in 1920, when the right to vote happens, it doesn't happen for Black women, because then we just re-inscribe the laws in a way that excludes Black women even more. So we have poll tax, we have all these things that now we have to have a whole civil rights movement and a voting rights act to eradicate those barriers that are then put up, because when women get the right to vote, in theory, Black women get the right to vote, and that is wholly unacceptable. So I think what women like Angela Davis do in that more radical political tradition is that they constantly preach a message of accountability. You must be accountable for your actions in the past, the present, and the future. We can't get to unity without accountability. And I think fundamentally, that is the message that she brings to this conversation, and those who think in that sort of tradition. And that's really important if you want to see like systemic and sustainable change. You know, we are at a place where the Voting Rights Act is in limbo, and there is some concern of people that we could see repeals and things happen if there is not accountability, right? So you need those voices as much as you need, we're all in this together. You need the voices that say, well, if we're in this together, then you're going to hear me. Flo Kennedy, Shirley Chisholm, these were also women who were very keen on holding people accountable for their actions. And that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you all. I'm thinking about so much at the moment. If there aren't, we can still take questions up until 7:30, but if you all don't have any questions at the moment, I'm going to proceed with the questions. I love this. So our last speaker, and this is kind of chiming in with our last speaker and our next speaker for Gallier Gatherings. Our last speaker talked about Afro Creole poetic sort of activist poetry. in sort of America's early African-American Black daily newspapers. And they talked about how those poetic expressions of activism amongst Afro-Creole men had existed. So we had Dr. Clint Bruce talk about that topic. But one of the topics that kept, or one of the questions that kept coming up was, you know, did they come across any Afro-Creole women, also known as free women of color during that time? And as we know, many of the efforts of the free people of color in New Orleans is sort of a precursor to the civil rights movement. So in you all studies about like, you know, the women's suffragist movement in Louisiana, did you all come across any sort of free women of color in sort of the post Reconstruction or even antebellum period? Any activism on the part of them?
I mean, I think what's important, well, one thing, it's very hard to find names, right? When you're digging into, when it comes to Black women, because a lot of times the research, unless you know where specifically to look, it'll just say a group of Black women. But I think in New Orleans, like I'm really researching more into like the Phyllis Wheatley Club and these sort of Black women clubs that existed that go back to free women in New Orleans who started these clubs, and then they became sort of part of the culture, you know, political culture, but also the culture of New Orleans. I believe there's even a school named after Sylvania F. Williams, or there was a school, because these women were so integral in the community. And it is, you know, a lot of times their efforts were not as recognized as their male counterparts for whatever reasons. Well, because their efforts, they were considered more domestic and weren't considered political. It wasn't political for these women to be in these groups, but the work that they were doing was political. And so I think that is a charge for those of us who are studying this time and studying this era, particularly as it relates to Louisiana, is to unearth those stories. So there's more than just Sylvania F. Williams that we talk about in terms of Black women and suffrage, but that we find the names of the free women who I'm sure were involved as much as they could in abolitionist movements and then suffrage movements and so on. I think we can begin to articulate names a little bit more clearly when we get to the civil rights era, but I think there is still some invisibility of Black, Afro-Creole, Afro-Caribbean women in terms of being able to say their names. I think that we haven't done due diligence in finding those names. And I say we, that is me. And so that is something that is incumbent upon my spirit as I am, you know, teaching the next generation of maybe future political leaders and you know, even in my own family, is to be able to not just say, and there were these women who did this stuff, but to be able to specifically say their names.
One other aspect of this is that a lot of the white suffragists had the luxury of having, you know, husbands who and domestic servants, you know, husbands who provided their, you know, their livelihood, and domestic servants who did their work for them. So they were free to go participate in protests and, you know, go for days at a time to, you know, picket or participate in suffrage parades. And some of the, you know, the Black women suffragists did not necessarily have that kind of luxury of time and resources.
Thank you. I guess we can just go with the last two questions. These are very loaded questions, but hey, we have time. So do you see Stacey Abrams as a possible presidential candidate in 2024? Will her race or gender be more of a barrier, considering Kamala Harris has pushed through a glass ceiling? and what can be done in a red state like Louisiana to get more women of color on the ballot. That was from the same person, all the questions.
Well, I'll start it, and then hopefully we'll kind of pass the torch a little bit. I think absolutely. I think that I think since we've had Kamala Harris and the sort of glass ceiling, as she put it, has been broken, does open the door to other candidates for, you know, any number of political positions, including presidential candidate. And really, I think the second question is closely linked. What can be done in a red state like Louisiana? And I think that circles back to Stacey Abrams, you know, having voter drives, getting young people engaged, getting them to vote, particularly in Louisiana, where we have a lot of African Americans. You know, getting people out registered to vote and voting is the best chance of opening up opportunity and getting them to run for office too, right? You know, trying to think about a path of fundraising for people and having events for people and showing up for people and giving them a voice. So what we're doing now with people of the past, carrying that on with people in the present and trying to, you know, help pave the way, and pretty much doing what the women that we're talking about have done, you know, for the past 100 years is continuing to be active politically. We're all educators here. So, you know, we have a lot of opportunities in the classroom to ask people questions that, you know, have them use their critical thinking skills and try to get them engaged civically and publicly. And I think that's what brings about those changes. Anyone else?
I think that moving away from the Electoral College would help. I saw a presentation about this recently, and I was really impressed because the speaker was saying that you know, when you're in a red state and you have the Electoral College, candidates don't come here because they don't really need to, and people who don't want to vote for Republicans, you know, their vote pretty much doesn't count. So if all the candidates really had to compete and for a popular vote, I think that it would open up the candidate pool more, because, you know, there are candidates who are actually more attractive than maybe, you know, the slate that is presented to us as this, you know, sort of default situation that we're stuck with.
I think definitely, I think what is happening, or what we're seeing happening, what we saw happen in this last election, what harkens back to the igniting of, you know, freedom networks, in terms of, this is something that is burning in my spirit that I have to be proactive about, I have to be educated about. And I think that's sort of the crux of the organization of the suffrage movement, is that there was an impassionment of, you know, up for freedom, right? Like, and for liberty and for justice. And it galvanized networks to form, and then not just to form, but to be effective in their organization, to push towards this, you know, project for the right to vote. I think what we have seen and what we saw in this last election is that very thing, right? Like, there is, you know, slavery was such an atrocity, a national atrocity, a societal atrocity. It was just such a horrible thing. And we saw just the complete disregard for human life, that it moved people to action. And I think that same spirit was awakened in this last election, and we saw the result of that. I think that I think with that sort of organization behind her, and with the right support, Stacey Abrams or any person of color or woman of color could be a viable presidential candidate. I think that you can't disregard the framework and the support that is required to make these sort of firsts or these sort of historical moments happen. And suffrage teaches us that. It takes a lot of work, a lot of organizing, some infighting, some figuring out squabbles, some splits, some starts, some splits again. Some, it feels like a Venn diagram of how we got to 1920, people being told they can't march, people saying, I don't care, I'm marching anyway. It takes so much organizing structurally, socially, politically, and all the ways that we can, all hands on deck to make this thing that we're fighting for happen. The lesson in that is if you can sort of mitigate the damage of the contention and focus on the end goal, then you get an end goal for some that allows you a foothold to work towards an end goal for all. I don't think that changes in 2020 or 2024. I think that perhaps the steps to change, there might be fewer of them with the breaking of a glass ceiling, but when you have intersecting identities, whether that be race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, geography, that you're always going to be constantly having to push towards something. The thing is, do you have a chorus of people behind you helping you, or are you doing that on your own? And I think that sort of makes the difference. I am encouraged by what I saw or heard from my students, from my own child who's 20, and her just willingness and just appetite for understanding the political moment that we find ourselves in, educating herself, even though she has me and other resources, knowing for herself and having a personal conviction about how they vote, and understanding the possibilities. I see a comment about ranked voting. She heard about that and she just locked into that idea of ranked voting. And that was outside of me. So I think there's this curiousness of what can be that is happening because of these firsts that we're seeing with our vice president-elect and sort of the new faces of the political movement are different faces than we've seen before. The diversity of faces that we're seeing as political leaders, I think that's opening up this idea of possibility and curiosity, and that is a hopeful place to be in, because that's not people defaulting back to what's always been. That's people looking at what can be and that I can be part of it. That's not a what can be for my parents or for my teachers or for my grandparents, but that I can actually be a part of this possibility of freedom for all, which is the ultimate, to me, feminist project. It's freedom for all. When one is free, we are all free, right? So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you all. Yeah, about the ranked voting, and I also had a follow-up about the idea of modifying the system as it relates to the Electoral College. And it makes me think about, that historical argument, the tyranny of the majority. So like, what do you all think? How do you all think that relates? Now, I totally agree that yes, if you are a Democrat voting in Louisiana, yes, it just, you do feel powerless because of the Electoral College. But in terms of that, the argument about the tyranny of the majority, what do you all think about that?
Yeah, I think the problem is more that it's the tyranny of the minority, because you have, for instance, a party that put 3 Supreme Court justices on the court who are ultra conservative, but that party has lost the popular vote in the last 3 elections. So, and it lost it by a huge amount in this particular recent election. And so, do those people really serve what the majority of voters in this country believe? I don't think so. So, and I think that as long as we're operating under this archaic system, it tends to repress change, good ideas, candidates who represent positions that a lot of people believe in.
Thank you all. We have time for one more question, but if we don't have any other questions, I don't either. So I would like to thank you ladies for this very, very informative discussion. We look forward to providing this recording to folks who weren't able to attend tonight. We thoroughly enjoyed you all. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for being able to get this project funded. It is a very important topic, and we appreciate you. Thank you for all the work that you do. And yeah, if one of us advances, we all advance. So thank you all.
Thank you for hosting us.
So without further ado, we bid you all good night. And again, this recording will be available 24 hours on our website after this talk.
Thanks.
All
Good
right.
night.
Good night.